What up, fam? You know who it is? It is Atheist Jr. with another live stream video. And to mix it up a little, I'm not reacting to Kent Hovind today. We're reacting to his protege, or somebody who sucks up to him. A Bit of Orange, the family-friendly Christian ministry, whose videos aren't exactly family-friendly if you really go through them and watch them. Case in point, this one. Now, if there's one thing that gets my goat, ladies and gentlemen, it's when creationists try to call Darwin a racist. First of all, even if Darwin was the most racist person ever, that wouldn't make evolution true. Hello to Brady in the chat. How's it going? Even if Darwin was saying the N-word every 10 minutes, that wouldn't make evolution untrue. But he wasn't racist. Darwin was actually one of the more progressive scientists of his time. They were called naturalists back then, but he was a lot more progressive when it came to topics of race and politics than his contemporaries. And when I say race in this video, I'm going to differentiate when I'm talking about how Darwin used the word race and how we use it in our modern context. But let's take a look at this dumpster fire of a video. Let me start from the beginning. Fair enough.
Hello, friends. Welcome to part 1 of the MetaDucky Race Appendix. Race, racism, and what it means to be human. In the first installment, we're going to explain what race is, where the concept of race came from, and how the problems we're having today getting along are Darwin's fault.
Of course they're Darwin's fault. It's much easier for young Earth science deniers to point the finger at Darwin rather than take a cold, hard look at how their own religion, Christianity, directly ties to racism in America, considering slave owners use the Bible as justification for owning slaves, and Darwin's entire family were abolitionists. You know, the Bible, that patriarchal, fundamentalist, Masoretic text with laws exclusively for land-owning men of one specific race and religion who were slave owners, instructed to execute homosexuals, rape victims, unruly slaves, the slaves who God specifically allowed them to take from the lands around them, so basically anyone who didn't look like them they could enslave. Sounds kind of racist.
Again. Step 1. Define your terms. That joke you just told was racist. Oh, what do you mean by racist? Good
This accent.
question. According to Google, racist is a person who shows or feels discrimination or prejudice against people of other races, or who believes that a particular race is superior to another. Oh, okay, I can see that. But also, according to Google, the use for racist as a word over time kind of took off like in the 1940s. Like, nobody even used it before that, apparently. Did racism not exist before the 1940s? Or does this mean something else about the way people thought about or talked about race? Also, the word racism, kind of the same thing. Like 1940s, people are like, oh, we're going to use the word racism now. Like before that, it was like, not at all. Of course, in the 60s, it got real popular. Like there was disco and drugs and the word racism. I don't know if those things are related. I'm just saying. Kind of weird. But racist is a person.
I'm cringing on the inside.
Who shows or feels discrimination or prejudice against people of other races, or believes a particular race is superior to another. What do we mean by race? What about you, the viewer? Have you ever heard anyone define this term? I haven't. Oh wait, what about Charles Darwin? Charles Darwin used it in the title of his book. Now, most people know Charles Darwin's book as The Origin of Species, but the full title of the original publication was On Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Oy vey, Chuck. You need to edit. But what are these favored races Darwin mentions in the title of his book? Now, in one sense,
the term race was used by Darwin in the title of Origin as a synonym for variety, breed, or form of an animal. because On the Origin of Species never mentions humans. It's specifically about animals and mostly like moss and like plants. A lot of it's kind of boring, but it's not about humans. And this image right here, this is not from On the Origin of Species. This image on the left, Darwin didn't make this image. This is from Ernst Haeckel.
The word races was used to just denote species. So Darwin is saying the preservation of preferred species. And as you can see by the illustration on the right there, Darwin's theory just...
Darwin was saying, when he said preservation of favored races, that simply means the varieties or breeds of animals that survive. So preferred just means that they lived, whereas others died. You know how like 98% of all species on Earth have died? Yeah. Favored races.
It just goes from some species of bacterial single-celled things to multi-celled things to worms to fish to lizards to some type of kangaroo to some kind of monkeys to some kind of ape to... Wait a minute. It's Reggie Watts. We evolved into Reggie Watts? Or we evolved from Reggie Watts? What are you trying to say, Chuck D? I mean, if this were true, we would all be much more musically talented because, you know, Reggie's got skills. That's all I'm saying. Anyway, on the left there, on the left represents what Darwin gave us for the evolution of human species. As you can see, it starts off...
Wrong. This image was not from Origin of Species. Darwin didn't make this. Ernst Haeckel did. He published this in his book. I forget the title. It was like On the Origin of Creation or something like that. It was written in German, so I'd have to look up a translation online, and I know the English translation does not have this diagram because it's very offensive, so they didn't publish it in the English translation. And Ernst Haeckel had polar opposite views on whether or not white people were a separate species from the other races. And when I say races, I'm talking about, you know, the modern usage like white or Asian, etc. Like I said, Darwin was actually quite progressive compared to his scientific contemporaries. The consensus among the most well-learned scientists of the time in Darwin's day was literally that white men were of a different species than black men. Darwin did not think like this, and he mocked people who thought this way because they could not agree on the number of species that made up man. So it's a bit dishonest to try and attribute this racist diagram to Darwin when he literally didn't make it.
It's off with some kind of monkey evolving to some kind of ape. What's meant to be shown here is that the ape evolves into the Africans, who evolved eventually through various stages into the Asians, I guess, and then into, eventually, at the front of the line there, the white Europeans. But let's look into this a little bit further. What's been accepted for a long time and is still...
Yeah, you're not wrong about that, but Darwin didn't make it, you liar.
Today, for the evolution of humanity, is called the out-of-Africa theory. So very simply, the human race evolved first in Africa. Now, you've seen this illustration. This is the March of Progress, where...
Yeah, it's also super outdated, and paleoanthropologists do not use the March of Progress anymore. It's completely obsolete.
There's some kind of monkey thing evolves into some kind of ape thing, eventually evolves into humans. And that's kind of as far as most people tend to understand it, but there's more in this illustration than most people realize. The front of the line is the civilized white European man. Back here we have the African ape. But then the illustration, while perhaps not clearly labeled, the theory tells us that the missing link between the white European man and the African ape is the African man.
Yeah, not clearly labeled because you're making all this shit up.
On this evolution of humanity theory, out of Africa theory, the African man is the evolutionary stage between apes and what is considered the civilized white man. And that's not just my opinion, that's what Darwin said, as I will show you. First of all, from National...
Oh, please do.
Geographic, here are some of our sort of humanoid ancestors. As you can see, these things are not intended to be fully human, even though that depends who you ask. But see how they're depicted. Dark hair, brown eyes, dark skin. Now this is National Geographic, but what National Geographic also points out is...
Okay, you see how these all have the prefix homo? Yeah, if it has that prefix, it means human. If it's something else like Australopithecus, then it's not human. Very simple.
Is that the evolutionary theory does not give us a context by which to consider all races equal.
Yes, it does.
They ask the question, what is almost human? Where is that line drawn? The important thing is, where does fully human happen, and who gets to decide?
It happens when you make the transition between the Australopithecines and the genus Homo, and paleoanthropologists decide this. And yes, it is arbitrary, but it's based on science.
Because somewhere in this continuum, there was an African ape, and at some point, that evolved to become the African man, the fully human African.
No, that's completely wrong. You're crushing everything down into a way shorter time span than what's actually represented by science.
Man. And then later on, through more stages of evolving upward and onward, came the white European. But who is it that decides that the African man is or is not as fully human as the white European? When National Geographic says almost human, where do they draw that line? Who gets to decide? Well, let's look.
They're not talking about white people versus black people. Also, there were people with light skin in Africa a long time ago. Okay? Human ancestors were not specifically dark-skinned.
Let's look at the words of Charles Darwin himself. Charles Darwin, upon meeting South American people, said this: I could not have believed how wide was the difference between savage and civilized man. It is greater than between a wild and domesticated animal. Viewing such men, one can hardly make oneself believe that they are fellow creatures and inhabitants of the same world. But Darwin had more to say about the differences between different species of human beings. Darwin wrote this: At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man, by which, of course, he meant white Europeans, will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break will then be rendered wider, for it will intervene between a man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of, as of present, between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla.
This is a favorite quote mine of creationists. Now, first of all, Darwin is making a technical argument as to the reality of the time. Like I said, Darwin was progressive for his time compared to other naturalists or scientists. His answer is that competition against those forms with some even small advantage tends to eliminate closely related forms, giving rise to an apparent gap between the remaining forms. Now, whether or not Darwin was right about that is irrelevant to the use of this quote mine, of course, since that's part of the context that creationists using it have removed. And he's not saying that, he thinks this is a good thing or he approves of this. He's merely talking about what the scientific opinion was of his time. It's just like how he talked about how other scientists thought that humans were made up of different species. He didn't believe that, but he talked about it in his papers. And it's similar to how in nature, the strongest tend to survive. And Darwin described this process in On the Origin of Species, but he didn't like it. Specifically, he lamented how cruel it was. Like, here's a quote from Darwin: I cannot persuade myself that an omnipotent God would have designedly created the parasitic wasp with the express intention of their larvae feeding within the living bodies of their host. So he was horrified by the way that this parasitic wasp would lay its babies in the body of a caterpillar, and that they would eat their way out of it once they were born. So he described how in nature the weakest animals were preyed upon and the strongest animals survived, but he didn't like it. He didn't approve of what they call Darwinism. And it's the same thing with how he's describing the term savage races and civilized races. He's just using the terminology of the 1850s, which, in case you didn't know, was a long time ago.
Really? So, a few matters of clarification. What Darwin is saying is that someday civilized men will exterminate and replace these savage races of men. He's not saying savage species of animal, things that make it.
Yeah, and he wasn't wrong, was he? I mean, this happened.
Dangerous to live. He is distinguishing between what he considers different species of human, saying
No, he's not. You're misinterpreting Darwin's words on purpose.
some are civilized and some are savage and animal-like, and that someday the civilized ones will exterminate and replace the savage ones so that throughout the world the only humans that exist are the civilized ones. What he considers to be these savage, low, animal-like races, he describes as the Negro or Australian, and by Australian he means the Aborigines, which even according to National Geographic, the line there, the out of Africa theory, goes African ape, African man, then Australian Aborigine.
Citation needed, motherfucker.
Despite the fact that Australia is far away, National Geographic has decided that the next species of man to evolve is the next darkest.
What?
This can be found taught in the National Geographic video, The Journey of Man. So as Darwin describes his vision of the future, he not only says that we're going to exterminate these savage races of men, but also what he calls the anthropomorphous apes. So the apes that he considered to be almost as human as the savage races of human.
I noticed you cut out a big part of the quote there.
These are the words of Charles Darwin. Is there any question where this philosophy would go if followed?
What philosophy? Wow. Okay. Well, I guess that's it. But it seems to me that you've not proven your point, because Darwin was not a racist. I mean, people in the 1850s were racist if you compare it to today's times. But even then, if you were, if you had the same views as Darwin back then, you would be politically left. You would be liberal, and you would be a lot more progressive than most people and the prevailing view in science. And like I said at the beginning of this video, even if Darwin was a racist, that doesn't make the things that he wrote in Origin of Species false. So try harder, bit of orange.